So I'm in the process now of finishing up a film that I've been working on for a year. The Freelancers Project is about a handful of freelance foreign correspondents living and working in Mexico, and these are the men and women who are taking the place of these full-time staff correspondents who don't exist in Mexico anymore, or at least they exist to a much lesser degree than they did when I was based in Mexico 4 decades ago. This is the first of what we aspire to be a series of films, documentary films about freelance foreign correspondents. And I think it's important and really timely because the world is getting smaller. It's getting more interconnected, and it's important for us to know who the people are who send us this information about how the world works. Anybody who knows anything about how this government works, how this country works, knows that journalism is really the fourth branch of government. A free press is the fourth branch of government, and when you start questioning the integrity of that fourth branch of government for your own needs, for your own ends, that's an issue. Vladimir Putin of Russia, and other folks, Maduro in Venezuela, and other folks around the world, they pick up that exact language. They call it fake news or noticias falsas or whatever it is in their own language, and they use that cue from our leaders here to attack their own media, and it has some devastating consequences for practitioners of our craft in foreign countries. To say that these people are the manufacturers of fake news is just such a reflection of such ignorance and voluntary misinformation. Is laughable. I mean, it's just laughable. I think the seed for journalism was planted during the 1960s when I was very young, and the Vietnam War was raging, and in my home we used to get on a weekly basis Life magazine. Life magazine is one of these large format picture magazines, but at that time, there was no internet, and magazines like Life magazine and Look magazine, this is where people like me, Americans, got our visual information. I remember being fascinated by these pictures of these, incredibly exotic countries and sometimes very violent pictures of the war there, and it took me a while to figure out that journalism was the path for me, but I eventually settled on journalism because I understood at a certain age that I wanted two things out of my life. I needed a career that could give me a ticket and a tool. A ticket in the sense that I was born and raised just outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where my Italian immigrant parents arrived from Italy in the 1930s so that the men in the family could work in the steel mills. Still, Pittsburgh at that time was the steel capital of the world. So my grandfathers, my father, all of my uncles, my brothers, and I all worked in the steel mills at one period. And I knew, after working a couple of summers in the steel mills, that I did not want to spend the rest of my life there working in the steel mills. So I wanted a ticket out of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. But I wanted also a tool with which I could, make my life a life of purpose and meaning, and somehow leave a record behind, leave some tracks behind, leave some impact behind on the people that saw, my work. I started out as a journalist in 1977 after finishing the coursework for a graduate degree at Ohio University in Athens, Ohio, not to be confused with Ohio State. Ohio University has and had back then a really outstanding journalism program. They still do. And upon finishing my coursework, I took an internship in Mexico City with an English language newspaper. That was in 1977. I was supposed to stay there for 10 weeks and then come back and finish a thesis-like paper and look for a job in the United States. I stayed at the paper for a year. I stayed in Mexico for 4 years and began to work for United Press International. It's a wire service like the Associated Press or Reuters. So I stayed in Mexico for 4 years doing that. And then I went to UPI's international desk in New York City, where I was an editor for a couple of years. Then I went back to Latin America and I went to live in Nicaragua in 1983, and I lived there for 7 years until 1990. So much recompense in terms of personal and professional gratification has been my association with Nicaragua. I covered the Nicaraguan Revolution, the Sandinista Revolution in 1979. I met my first wife there. I first covered conflict there. I covered the counter-revolution during the 1980s for Newsweek magazine. I still have, deep, professional, personal, emotional links to Nicaragua and her people. So that, without question, is the story, a prolonged experience. I lived there for 7 years. The prolonged experience that I'm most connected to, by far. Because so much of my work was associated with conflict, I did not engage my first wife with my work because it was just too dangerous. Having said that, and now at this period of my life, when I spend less time covering conflict, I still do occasionally, but on a much more reduced basis. So I do engage my second wife. She's an editor. She edits most of what I do, so she is engaged on that level. But I would never take her to places like Guatemala or El Salvador or Iraq or Afghanistan. That's not a smart thing to do. I met my second wife on assignment in Havana in 1991. We met there and then went for years and years without seeing each other, reconnected over a period of time. And we were married in the year 2000. So we've been, married for almost 20 years, but we've known each other for quite a bit more than that. So it's been a long relationship. I joke with my students. I tell them the job of a foreign correspondent is, you go to these exotic countries, you meet these beautiful people, and you marry them. That's the job. When I really started to study journalism, David Halberstam, who was a New York Times correspondent covering covering the Vietnam War, was certainly a model of mine. He wrote this book, The Best and the Brightest, which is it's a handful of classics about the war in Vietnam. And I actually met Halberstam years ago when I was studying at Ohio University. And he was one of the handful of correspondents who really challenged the U.S. government's official line about what was happening in Vietnam. American journalists told America that we can't do this anymore. And the military had to follow. And I think what's happening in this country today, and particularly because we see that the Congress is so unwilling or unable to do the right thing, I really believe that it's going to be the American media who help save some of the ideals of what America aspires to be. I happen to think that I was, fortunate enough to be a journalist during what I consider to be the golden age of journalism. I caught the tail end of the golden age of journalism when the craft was more about information than it was about entertainment. We know now that journalism, much of it has been turned into a business. I get that. But I also know that within that context of stardom and business, there are still many outlets, many good outlets who still understand what their real role is, and that real role of the journalist is to be part of the system of checks and balances that make our republic what it is. One of the things that I didn't like about covering news, about being a working journalist, was the fact that my life always had to revolve around the words and actions of other people. I was kind of like a satellite, circling around those events that were happening. And when you lead a life like that, you feel that you're losing some control over your own destiny. Here, I have greater control over my own destiny. I can choose and pick the projects that I want to do, when I want to do them, how I want to do them, and still have an impact at this institution. Teaching allows me to have an impact on younger people and the next generation of journalists. Not only that, you want to diversify, you want to change, you want to keep growing. Being associated with a university like American University in Washington, D.C., in the United States Capitol, is just an extraordinary opportunity to influence not just my students, but the craft in general. My job, I think, in part, is to work and be an ally of truth and those who are telling the truth.